Okay, so it looks like it's about time to start the next talk. So today I'm going to be talking to you about PDFUA 101, introducing you to the PDFUA format and what it sets out to achieve and how it goes about achieving that. I should say before I start, my name is Matthew Hardy. I'm the primary representative for Adobe on the PDFUA committee, so I work on that standard and have helped to draft the previous version as well as the next version. So, PDF for universal accessibility. We finally published it after many years of development in 2012, and we released a minor revision in 2014, cleaning up a little bit of language that had not been gone through correctly and such. But basically, it's been out in the field for several years now. It's a subset standard, just like the other subset standards. So we have subset standards for archivability, for engineering, for print exchange, for variable and data transactions. And so basically, it's a standard that's aimed at, it uses PDF to achieve an end result. It is standard PDF, there's nothing magical about it, but it targets accessibility within PDF. Let's just talk a little bit about what we're trying to achieve with accessibility. I think too commonly people think of accessibility as being solely focused on people with, for example, blindness or low vision. And actually, accessibility goes much beyond that. While these are very obvious and sort of targetable traits, there are a lot of people with other types of issues. There's dyslexia, and different fonts can help someone who's dyslexic consume content more easily. There are people who have motor issues where controlling a PDF can be a challenge. And so we're not just talking about content access in a way that can be read aloud, but we're talking about assistance to anyone who needs help when accessing a document and cannot access it in its standard form or has to interact with it in a certain way. So that can mean access to the content for read aloud and other purposes. It can mean descriptions of things that are maybe encoded in a way. For example, if someone's deaf and you have sound, you have to be able to describe what's being consumed in the document. A lot of it is about context. It's about giving people sufficient information to consume content regardless of their disability. And for PDFs particularly, and for longer documents, navigation. And it can be high-level navigation, but also content navigation is critical when consuming content. And I'll get into the specifics of that as we go through this talk. Why is PDF accessibility hard? We've had accessibility standards for the web. WCAG covers things like PDF as well as HTML. But PDF actually has several challenges that make it something that has to be targeted. Basic PDF was designed for exchange. It was a final form layout format, and its intent was to reproduce print across multiple devices. It's entirely appearance focused, and it was for accurate interchange. It's comprised of content streams that paint onto a canvas, and that painting can be optimized for the layout or for the device. It has very little to do with the actual meaning of the content because that was intended to be consumed once printed to paper. So the order was mostly irrelevant. And the visual fidelity was the key. Accessibility was not considered in the first versions of PDF. Obviously, since then, it has been considered, and PDFUA builds on those considerations. But that's why we need to consider this in PDF, because you can craft a really bad PDF that's incredibly inaccessible, or you can craft a PDF that's well designed and have it incredibly accessible. And so writers of PDF, writers of consuming applications have to think about these things when producing and consuming PDF. So what does PDF Universal Access, or PDFUA do? It's aimed at giving equal access to content, or equivalent access. So the idea is that you can get to things in the content, interact with them, manipulate them in a way that someone without whatever that disability is could do. It's for those who require assistive technology. Assistive technology is tooling that goes alongside software to assist people who need to access it. So, for example, if I'm using my iPhone and I turn on assistive technology, it gives me a layer for interacting such that if I'm blind, it will tell me what I'm touching on the screen. when I hold down the screen, it will give me a context menu that I can move to very easily, and again, will tell me what I'm interacting with in a way that doesn't require me to be actually reading a screen. But this is much more than access to the textual content of a page. Just to be clear, that we're not just talking about access to the text, although that's a bare minimum, but we're talking about access to the semantics of the document, the ability, as I said, to navigate through that document, and to interact with that document. PDFUA itself achieves this through 3 mechanisms. It specifies requirements on file format, such that things writing PDF produce good, accessible PDF. It tells you what you as a consuming piece of software must do with that PDF to make sure it's accessible. And it also provides provisions for this assistive technology that's interacting with a consuming application to talk to that and do something with it. And just to be clear, there's nothing that says that it can't be one piece of software that does all 3 of these things: writes software, consumes software, and provides assistive technology. But they can also be 3 different things. It could be a piece of software that produces the PDF, that's then distributed, consumed by a consumption piece of software, for example, Google Chrome, and then basically consumed by assistive technology that's platform specific. So I'm going to break this talk down into, I'm going to talk about the file format requirements, and then later I'll talk about those consumption requirements and the assistive technology requirements. So I've already said, PDF files have to be crafted for accessibility. I don't think it's hard to do, but it's something you have to do if you intend it to be accessible, because you can do it badly if not. We've provided very strict rules that go beyond the requirements of standard PDF to ensure those pieces of accessibility, but it's built from standard PDF techniques. There's nothing new or invented in PDFUA. It is all just standard compliant PDF. And the audience for the file format is definitely people who are creating and editing PDFs. So someone who's reading the PDFUA specification looks at it, this part of it, if they're writing PDFs. PDF writers must follow these rules if they claim PDFUA compliance. There's nothing in the industry that says you shall be PDFUA compliant, but if you intend to support this, this is what you'll do when you write a PDF. So this is for the software authors who are producing PDF. The author, and I don't mean the software author, but the creator of a document also plays a large role in this, because a lot of this is stuff that can't be guessed at by software. Authors have to provide information. And so there is a burden on authors to actually interact with this and contribute. And then the consumption piece of this relies on these various building blocks to produce good, accessible experiences. So at the basis, the basics of PDFUA are some very simple content rules. These are kind of low-level things just to stop some bad experiences. They're mostly around interactivity, but blinking, for example, has often been considered harmful on the web. It's harder to actually do blinking in PDF, but it can interact with people who have low vision. It can disrupt them from reading. For example, for sounds, as I already mentioned, you have to have at least a description of what that sound is conveying, so that a consumer can at least know what they're perceiving something, or not perceiving something that was intended as part of the content. Another thing, for example, color blindness. You cannot, PDFUA requires that if you convey something using layout, color, some sort of appearance, you have to describe it semantically as well. So that someone who cannot perceive that, for example, someone who's red-green colorblind cannot see that the text is red or green. Also it talks about things like scanned images and providing OCR text for them, and making sure that text is correct. So a large part of PDFUA is about correctness. There's very few rules about the metadata of a file, but I just wanted to touch on them. There's one very hard and fast rule. File names are not good conveyors of file content. You often put a file name that's just something that you put on disk. We use the extensible metadata platform, XMP, to embed metadata in PDF. And there's only one real requirement in PDFUA, which is that you provide the doubling core metadata title information, and that you use that when showing the file. So basically, the idea is that something that describes the nature of the file and isn't just a placeholder on disk. But we don't preclude any other metadata. You can make it as rich and complete as you want, but we have a minimum requirement. But the real basis of PDFUA is tagged PDF. So PDF has defined since PDF 1.4 this concept of logical structure and semantics within documents. And it's the basis of PDFUA. 90% of the file format requirements talk about tagged PDF and how to use it correctly. Tagged PDF itself gives you basic content access. It tells you things like you will have textual mappings. You'll be able to map a glyph to a Unicode character. You'll have spacings between words to ensure that a processor knows where a word ends and the next word starts. But tagged PDF goes further than that. It introduces a layer of semantics and logical structure. The logical structure defines the reading order of a piece of content. It also provides the content semantics. It describes things such as headings and paragraphs and lists and tables. And without that, you don't really know as a user what you're interacting with. And for basic content, maybe you can get away with that. But as you'll see in my examples, it very quickly becomes inaccessible if you don't describe the semantics. PDFUA requires that the semantics in a document are accurate and has stricter rules about the requirements. So tagged PDF is a general mechanism. You can use it as much or as little as you want. PDFUA mandates its use. And thus semantics become critical to rich access and navigation of a document. I talked a little bit about this already. Text is not fundamentally accessible in PDF. You have to do something to make it accessible. And in my talk this afternoon, I'll actually be going into real technical detail on how to achieve this. But you must map it to Unicode, as I said. The logical structure defines the reading order for the content, which allows it to be accurately consumed by a piece of software. For example, I included here a PDF that was distributed for an accessibility conference next month. That's a reasonably inaccessible document if it's not tagged. Thankfully, it's a PDFUA document and it's very accessible. But when you look at how stylistic and typed out that is, what is the reading order of that? How do you consume that? Without this information, you can't do that. And you also need to convey things like language of content so that you can actually have it spoken out loud correctly and so that it can be processed. Moving away from text for a second, what about graphics that are non-textual? Most documents have figures, they have captions associated with them. PDFUA mandates the requirement that figures must be identified as figures. It distinguishes between a concept called an artifact and real content. Real content is stuff that actually makes up the document, and artifacts are artifacts of typography, layout, backgrounds, headers and footers and things like that. So you must include the real content in the logical structure tree. We don't require things like captions, but we point out that they're very valuable, and if you have a caption on an image, that it's associated with the figure to which it belongs. If you have something that's an image group, where you have multiple figures that comprise a single graphic, and you could argue whether the one I've included here is a real example, but basically, when you have multiple images that comprise a single figure, those should all be grouped so that they're not consumed as individual items, but they're consumed as a single piece of content. There's also graphics that represent text. So obviously in PDF, text is represented as a first-class piece of content. You have fonts and all that other good stuff, but there are other representations of content. You might have an image that represents some content. You can have ASCII art, and there's an example of that on the right-hand side here. You might imagine a drop capital that's included as a rich picture that's put into the start of a document. Tagged PDF gives you the capability to indicate their intent. It allows you to describe the actual text for an image or a figure, and that can be consumed when extracting that content, whether it's for read aloud, copy and paste, depending on what you want to do with it. Actual text must be an exact representation of the content. It must be equivalent to what a sighted user would see when consuming that content. And it's very valuable for many, many purposes. Headings. Headings are a fundamental part of document navigation. They allow you to segment and section a document. The one thing PDFUA goes beyond PDF in is allowing headings beyond level 6. So PDFUA defines the concept of headings level 7+. And there's two types of heading structure. There's what we call weak and strong. And actually, weak is the most common. And so basically, I showed two examples on the right. One which is, the top level one is a strong example, where nesting of headings defines the depth and structure of the document. And the bottom is what we call weak, where we just put things like H1s and H2s into the content stream to identify the level of the heading. To be clear, PDFUA does not care which you use. It just mandates that you don't mix them, because it's very confusing to try to process a document that mixes these concepts. But both can actually be converted to the other. They are equivalent. And so there's no harm in using either of those. PDFUA mandates a strict ordering of headings. You can't jump down levels. So you can't jump from H1 to H3. You have to go through H1, H2, H3. You can have any number of H2s and H3s in a row. And you can always jump from an H4, for example, back to H1 because you're closing a section. But what you cannot do is go from an H1 to an H3 or to an H4 because it makes navigating the document very hard. And this is a big use in navigation, particularly in large documents. One of the standard paradigms for access on computers is to skip levels of headings, say move from heading 1 to the next level 1 heading. And it's how people who need this technology move through documents efficiently. And so this is a fundamental required part of PDFUA. Another complex piece of structure that's well represented in PDFUA are tables. You might imagine a really simple table. I didn't provide an example because they're really obvious. But when you start to get complex tables, it's clear why they're hard to access. A person who cannot see a table finds it very hard to navigate that table unless they can determine which headings, which cells are associated with which headings, whether headings are row headings or column headings. And so this can be provided in Tag PDF, and PDFUA mandates that that information is provided. One of the requirements is that you can unambiguously tell for any given cell which headers it belongs to. Lists are equally represented. What we say in PDFUA is that lists have to be represented as lists, not too surprising, and that you shouldn't represent non-lists as lists. It's quite common to use layout paradigms that kind of emulate these structures, and it feels natural to tag these as such. But the intent here is conveying semantics. So you only tag something as a list if it's intended to be consumed as a list. Lists have labels. Those are not considered part of the real content of the page generally, but they have to be represented so that they can be consumed by a reader. And so if you take the example I've got on the right of a somewhat artificial list, but when you look at how complex lists can be, it's really important that they're well represented structurally so that I can move through them. We allow the labeling on the list to be identified within PDF and described so that it can be consumed by software. So it can decide if I say move to the 4th item in this list, it can do so unambiguously. Or move to the item marked V, and it can find it in the list. And it does that not just using the content, but actual semantics that describe that content. And as you can see, lists have nesting. That lists are contained within lists. And so taking this example, there's a top-level list with 2 items, vegetables and dairy. And then the top list has a sub-list of 3 items. The first item has another sub-list of 2 items. And so this is really important as I move around a document and navigate it, that I can interact with this as a list and not just as a linear stream of content. Mathematics is incredibly common in documents. Most people consider it to be a fundamental part of writing. And traditionally, it's not very well conveyed in documents. It's usually typeset, and the typeset is quite hard to consume. If I try to read a mathematical formula from a document using standard software, you're going to get a bad experience. And so in PDFUA Part 1, there's not too much we can do with that. What we've basically said is you shall identify mathematics as a formula, and you shall provide descriptions of the content. Now, we don't say what those descriptions should be, to be clear. You might say, this is the formula for energy conversion, or this is a formula describing X, so that the person can go look that up somewhere else. You could also write a description of the actual formula. But the idea is that a blind reader, for example, can get that content and at least know how to turn that into something real. In PDF 2.0, we're enhancing this to make math a first-class citizen. And so this isn't in PDFUA Part 1, but future versions of PDFUA will allow math to be marked up as a true first-class citizen of PDF and be able to be consumed as mathematics. So PDF documents can be quite long. They can also be quite short. But it's really important when you're navigating a big document that you provide some higher level navigation. And that's achieved in PDF through a document outline. The outline stands separate from the content and basically describes various items within the content. Commonly, it matches up to that heading order that we already talked about, but it doesn't have to. It's up to the author to decide what the right level of outline is. But we do require in PDFUA that it's correct. We ask that it be present, but we cannot demand that it be present because there are documents for which an author just doesn't have an outline, and we can't mandate something that's impossible to achieve. But we strongly recommend that if you include document outlines, particularly for longer documents, it's easy to consume. In the case of some Adobe software, you've seen this as a bookmarks panel that appears and that you can then navigate separately to the content and then move to content within the page. It's a huge navigational aid, and it's fundamental to good access to documents. I chose a particularly crazy example here just to highlight the extremes to which you can go with annotations. But annotations don't traditionally live on the page. They live outside of the page content. They sit as a layer on top of it, and they're described belonging to the page, but they're linked to separate entities. To associate those annotations with the content to which they belong, the logical structure tree from Tag PDF can be used. And so basically the requirement is that annotations, if they're considered content, belong in the structure tree. Because annotations are complex, it's very important to describe them if they do not have a natural textual representation. So if I have a text box that's just a pure representation of text, that text stands by itself. But if I have a cloud shape that I intend to convey some semantics in my document, it's important that that is conveyed to the user through some description. Interactivity is important with annotations. Annotations are one of those things that you commonly tab through on the page. And it's really important that tab orders be defined to make sure that as you interact with those, that you interact logically with them in order. So tab order has to be specified in PDFUA for interactive elements. If it's a form, you should identify those fields that make up a form so that they can be described as such. Form fields must appear in the logical structure. They can never be artifacts because they're intended to be consumed. Another type of annotation are links. Links are very common, and one of the things that we required in PDFUA is that links have descriptions on them. The reason being that long URLs are very hard to consume when being read out loud, and to describe where a link goes, as well as having the URL present, helps a person consume it. A common thing on the web and that is achievable in PDF are link maps, where you basically have a region and multiple links that if you click in certain parts. As you might imagine, someone who has motor skill issues or someone who cannot see would have a really hard time interacting with that. And so another requirement of PDFUA is that equivalents are provided such that people who do have those issues cannot be blocked from accessing those links. Because one of the major things so one of the ways the content is accessible is not just for read aloud, as I described. It's not just about giving access to the blind. Reflow is quite common in documents. Giving people the ability to zoom and magnify content is really important. And so because of that, we require that fonts be embedded within the document, because this ensures accurate rendition of the content. It ensures that because the width and height data is present, when I reflow that content, it looks reasonable. It's consumable. It also ensures that as I move from system to system, the content is represented accurately, and so it doesn't get in the way of consumption. We allow subsetting of fonts because fonts can be very large, and so we allow them to be decreased in size, but every glyph that's used in the document has to be present. And as I said earlier for text, Unicode mappings for those fonts are essential. If you don't have the correct encoding, you cannot get to the text. And without the text, there's so little you can do. It makes documents incredibly inaccessible. And so there's several ways to do this. One is to provide known encodings. Another is to produce a character map that maps specific glyph indexes to character codes in Unicode. And one of our requirements is there is an ability in Unicode to say, this glyph just isn't defined. When this is a not defined character, you can't use those in PDFUA documents if they're part of the content, because you can't read those to someone. So I haven't covered every aspect of PDFUA documents or every facet of the requirements, but I've tried to highlight the majority of the big ones. So I want to touch now on conforming readers. So we already talked about the fact that PDFUA is split into 3 sets of provisions. File format, which I just covered, and now conforming readers or consuming applications are the second one. I already said that the majority of the rules in PDFUA are aimed at the file format. But we do have some very important rules around consuming applications to ensure accessibility. And those rules really rely fundamentally on the file being correctly specified and meeting those requirements. If the file format is not correct, the best conforming reader can only do so much. So what do we require? Well, these are very specific rules. If you claim that you are a PDFUA compliant processor, you shall follow these rules. And these rules describe what type of data should be provided to the user. So for example, the logical structure, the semantics of the content. If that's in the document but isn't provided to an end user, it's useless. And so we mandate that that information that we provided in the PDF is exposed to the user. So that includes tags and all the different structure types that belong to those tags. It includes any attributes that go along with them that describe content. For example, that this was struck through content. There's layout attributes. There's things in tables, for example, to do column spanning. If that information isn't presented to the consuming application, it didn't add any value to the PDF. It also talks about what a consuming application will expose to assistive technology and how assistive technology can get access to that. We don't mandate any specific technologies or APIs. What we say is what the intended effect is supposed to be, what type of access they should have. We also put some requirements around interaction. Particularly people with motor skill disabilities have challenges when interacting with content that moves. If someone is playing a video, you don't want it to start automatically. And so we provide a lot of rules around how to process that content to ensure that a user gets easy access to the content. So fundamentally required for accessibility, we have the content access itself. You must provide the Unicode representations of the text to the consuming application, or to the user. That all the semantics are presented. The document is navigable, and I have another slide that talks a little bit more about navigation. That the reading order is provided. That logical reading order that was defined by the logical structure has to be provided to the user. And there are other higher level structures. For example, I can have file attachments in a PDF that don't necessarily belong to the actual page content. I might have the original source document, a Microsoft Word document, for example, that was used to author the document. And if I've embedded it, the consuming application has to inform the user that that content is present, and at least give them the means to access it if that application can access it. And all that metadata we talked about, only one specific piece, but all the metadata that is present in a file should be provided to the user. Now, as you might imagine, with longer documents, the biggest challenge once you get past basic contents and semantics is that navigation. And so PDFUA says for consuming or compliant applications that they should provide 4 types of access. We've all seen documents that have front matter and end matter where the numbering of the pages is not the logical numbering. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, I start with a section that goes, I uses Roman numerals basically at the start of the document, and then page 1 is the 10th logical page of the document. If I, as a sighted user, use that information, for example, the printed page number to convey to a non-sighted user to go look at a page in a document, how do they get to that? They do it through page labels. There is a way in PDF to specify that the page labels are named as such. And so when I say go to page 22, That might be the 32nd page in the logical document, but using page labels, we can identify which page has which label. And so we require that consuming applications provide that as a means of navigation. Logical structure. It's very common for people to interact with the headings, as I already said, moving up and down headings, skipping over to the next heading to quickly move and navigate through documents. But more importantly, when I'm in a table, the ability to move from cell to cell in logical order, the ability to go and inspect the heading that was associated with it, all of these are fundamental types of navigation within documents. And so we require that all of that information be exposed. I already talked about the document outline. Again, a consuming application must use that document outline for navigation. So it's not enough that it's just in the file, it has to be something that can be accessed. And destinations. Destinations are a mechanism within PDF to describe a location, and they tell you how to move from one location to another location. They often come with changes of zoom. So for example, you can say, fit the page, or go to this specific rectangle on a page. If you imagine someone who's maybe has low vision and wants to view that page zoomed in, they don't want every time they click on a destination to have that zoom change and then to have to go back to the level of zoom they want to use. So one of the things that we require is that if the user has overridden the document preferences for zoom and has turned on accessibility, that those be honored even across these types of links. And that ensures that users get reasonable experiences as they're moving through the document, and they're not constantly being disrupted trying to get their view back to the right view to get to the content. Assistive technology is the third piece in the puzzle for PDFUA. And a lot of it, obviously, as you might imagine, interacts very closely with what the requirements for the consuming application. In fact, it's that bridge between these two pieces of software that usually makes good accessibility possible. Some types of software assistance include read aloud. There's enhanced navigation. For example, JAWS allows you to basically pull up a list of tables, a list of lists, a list of headings, and to quickly navigate over that separately from the content. They allow you to do semantic inspection. What is this type of content? Am I looking at a heading, a paragraph, a table? Because once I know what I'm interacting with, I can use all those other good features I've already talked about. And they can extend the content to access. They can extend access to content such that I can actually get and inspect content and find out more about its context and information. You can imagine there's a lot of devices you have to do this around. And the world was a simpler place not that long ago where we had really 2 or 3 major OSs where we had to support this type of stuff. Nowadays, we're still using laptops and desktop computers, but accessibility is equally important on mobile devices. It can be conversions to Braille readers. And some of these types of accessibility are built into the platform, and some are external. So for example, on Windows, it's common to install an external piece of software to interact with it, although Windows does include, and as does the Mac, built-in capabilities. On iOS and Android, for example, it's much harder, and it has to be built in for the most part. And so you're interacting with the OS very closely. And so it's really important that the consuming software doesn't get in the way of AT, and that AT be provided access to all of that content. And so that's a fundamental requirement, is that these have a bridge between them. And that bridge is to provide access to the content. And so a lot of this is just repeating the concepts, but just reminding us that that content semantics has to be provided at AT. And so, for example, as I brought up at first, if I'm using iOS, and iOS has a very nice interaction model for accessibility, you need to expose your information to that so that it can provide that to the user. Things like optional content that allow you to turn off and enable content. If the end user doesn't have a means to control that, it makes it very hard to access the content. And all those navigational structures that I talked about for the consuming application have to also be exposed by AT to the end user, because alternative means of access are critical. Applications may expect you to use menu items or click in specific places in the UI. AT might provide you with alternative means of access. And so, just to summarize, PDFUA is built upon 3 basic principles: that your file has to be correct and that the file format requirements are fundamental to accessibility, that the consuming application or the conforming reader uses those capabilities to access the content, and that it provides those to assistive technology to allow these other uses to be made. Okay, so that's PDFUA 101.